Hi, my name is Maura Shrey, and my topic is the relationship between colonial history and EU foreign aid. So, first I wanted to go over some definitions that will help us understand the rest of the topic and discuss it on the same page. So first I wanted to talk about colonial history, which in this slideshow will refer to the member states of the EU's history during the colonial era of subjugation of various dependent territories to imperial rule for their own economic gain at the expense of the territory's native populations. So that's a little wordy, but basically we all know what colonialism is, we all know what a colony is, but what I really want to take from that is that the EU didn't have any colonies. Individual member states had colonies. And so the history is divided between individual member states and the colonies that they had. When we refer to foreign aid, we'll be referring to the economic relief allocated to countries or causes outside of the European Union who have been classified as in need. So we've learned a lot in class about the money that goes to states within the European Union, and this is going to be all about the money that goes to states outside of the EU. So with those definitions in mind, I would love if y'all could take some time to think about what connections you see between colonialism and EU aid. So based on the readings we did, based on what you already knew or what you've seen in the news or learned in a history class, what connections do you already see there that we could talk about further? So first, I thought it would be helpful to just kind of look at a map of EU colonial history. Unfortunately, when trying to find a map of EU colonial history, I fell a little short. So I am attempting to build my own, but the accuracy, cartography-wise, should not be at all attributed to me, and we should all just accept that I'm pointing to regions and not specific countries. So first, during the colonial era, I wanted to talk about how Europe really boomed and really started to spread quickly and largely across the entire globe. So some major examples are the Spanish in Central America and the Caribbean and South America, the English in India and the Far East, Australia and everyone in America. In Canada, you have a lot of French influence and colonies. But majorly, I want to focus on Africa. The scramble for Africa led to almost every major European power covering almost every inch of Africa and controlling colonies in that region. So, based on this, I'd like you to keep this map in your head and understand where the colonial influence largely focused. But based on this, let's look at where aid is given. And you'll see that it largely reflects the map you've just seen. So America, Canada, China, some of those more developed countries don't receive a ton of aid from the European Union. China maybe as an exception. But in Central and South America and the Caribbean, you see a lot of aid given. In the Pacific Islands, you see a lot of aid given. And largely in Africa, you see a large central focus of European Union aid given to African countries. So, what are the colonial connections to European aid? The original Treaty of Rome recognized the African colonial legacies of more than 6 of its member states, which means that the European Commission has to factor in the history of colonialism when addressing aid. So modernly, that's something that they talk about and they discuss because it's built into the way the European Commission functions. Now, Africa, as we just saw, has largely become the focus of European foreign aid. And when examining the macroeconomic and political forces determining allocation of EU aid, colonial history seems to be the first and most obvious factor to many who study it. So, what is this EU aid doing? What's it for? The EU, like other countries or coalitions in the world, which I'd once again like to point out that largely the EU is not a country, it's a coalition of member states, and so it's a little bit different than a lot of the aid from other major world powers, but it still must make strategic choices on which challenge they can focus on in the short run. The EU has chosen to focus on climate, migration, and exports of weapons. Obviously, there are other causes that they're passionate about and that they focus on, but those three have become the large focuses on allocation of aid and where they're giving aid, what sorts of NGOs they might fund, things like that. So I wanted to really focus on EU versus AU perspectives on the connection between colonial history and EU foreign aid. The AU is the African Union. So this is largely an issue from 2017 to today that has been discussed between the EU and the AU. The AU has a perspective that's largely frustration with continued interference from European, their former colonial powers. Most independence was gained relatively recently in the scheme of things, and AU countries largely feel that there is undue influence from European powers due to their increased influence in the state and continued interference in the sovereignty of the state. The EU, on the other side, believes that their contributions to these countries are helping to solve the problems that their colonialism left behind. Largely, the African countries are not capable on their own of solving the problems that they face in development, in human rights, in poverty, and the EU is almost taking responsibility for the problems that they've caused by providing aid in their own perspective. So I found two separate really good TED Talks that kind of describe these perspectives and put into perspective, I hate that I used that word twice, but put into perspective the differences between the country receiving aid and the country giving aid. So first, the AU perspective. And obviously this is a video, so I'm not sure if you're going to be able to click this link, so I'm going to include it separately. But if you want to pause and go to this video from the 44-second mark to 2 minutes and 30 seconds, she describes the perspective of the country that might be harmed by aid. So if you want to pause and go watch that, we can talk about it then. So hopefully you watch that clip, and you'll notice that largely countries receiving this kind of aid are becoming more unstable and are not receiving the benefits that the aid is supposed to be providing. In contrast, the countries or coalitions providing the aid are receiving monetary benefits for providing the aid, economic benefits for providing the aid. And this is a huge problem in Africa specifically. In comparison, another TED Talk shows the EU perspective, or NGO's perspective, specifically in this situation, on aid. So this specific TED Talk is from the Gates Foundation, or a representative of the Gates Foundation, but in this clip he mentions how these kind of foundations are then reporting back to powers like the EU and largely influencing their decisions on allocation of aid and I thought it was interesting how those kind of foundations influence on allocation of aid also influences the perspective on why aid might be good. So if you want to pause and listen to this clip from 4 minutes and 20 seconds to 6 minutes and 10 seconds. So I then have a couple discussion questions. So does the EU's distinction between developed and non-developed countries make a positive or negative impact on their allocation of aid, and why? Do you sympathize more with the EU or AU's perspective on continued aid in Africa? And say the AU's interpretation is correct, how might aid be provided in a way that respects sovereignty and avoids imperial benefit? And then that's just my bibliography. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to hearing what you guys think.